All right.
Uh-oh.
It's been a while, Marge.
Uh-oh.
How are you?
It's fine until you said you were going to pick on me.
Well, Well, Nick's picking on you. Nick didn't even have your mic on.
There we go now.
Ah,
There
okay.
we go. Oh, now we
okay.
can hear you.
You haven't been with us since we've launched the podcast and we got all the new headsets and things, right?
No kidding. Nick was chuckling with me a little bit ago, trying to put the headset on for the first time. I feel like I'm talking into my ears. It's just
You
strange.
sound great though.
Okay.
Is it muffled
Cool.
or is it good?
Well, on my end,
Yeah.
well, it's clear, but it
Well,
sounds
Todd's voice is muffled all the
Always,
time.
always. Yeah, have to do that. You have to do that. Yeah.
All right. Well, Marge, we appreciate it. And I last year and a half, every time we invite you on, you're like, well, we need to have so and so on, and you bring such guests. But our listeners like miss you and miss this battle that we do, that Todd and I do.
Well, I hope I kick your butt.
I know
This
you
always
do.
makes me nervous. Doesn't matter how long you've been doing it.
All right. So let's jump right in. Scenario number one.
Ooh.
Buyer submits an offer with a completed, and it's funny because I normally don't read these, and I read the first one, just only the first one. I'm like, oh, great. But the buyer submits an offer with a completed pre-qualification form for conventional financing. 10 days after contract acceptance, the buyer submits an LSU for FHA financing. Okay, does the buyer need the seller's approval to change from conventional to FHA in the first 10 days? So this is where I got tripped up.
Good.
Okay, my first response is no, unless it impacts the bottom line for the seller. If all of a sudden their proceeds get affected, then no permission would be required. But since we're moving to an FHA, and let's say it doesn't appraise, now that appraisal is tied to that property for said period of time. So my answer to the question is I don't know.
This one's really, actually, the contract gives you the answer really for this one in many ways. It has the section under finance. There's two sections in the contract called changes. One that deals with anything that you didn't know that you're now learning, meaning being told by the seller. The other one is finance, and this one falls under finance. And basically the answer is the second hash mark down, part of the answer, because it says, basically, does the change from conventional FHA or FHA to conventional or FHA to VA or anything? Does it affect the buyer's ability to obtain loan approval without conditions? So is it making it more difficult, as the contract reads, is it making it more difficult for the buyer to qualify to be approved? Number two, is it increasing the seller's closing costs in any way, which we know going from conventional FHA does, and then going or delay close of escrow. So if either of these three conditions exist, then you move from it being that the buyer just needs to notify the seller of the change in loan type to the buyer has to seek seller approval to be able to change your loan. That's right. You heard it right. The buyer may not be able to, or it may be a condition that the seller says you're trying to renegotiate the contract, and therefore I'm going to say, yeah, I'm going to cancel the contract because you're trying to renegotiate. Marge?
But does the seller have the right to cancel the contract arbitrarily?
No.
And the answer is no.
Right.
I mean, there really are a lot of moving components in this one. And it really is fun because we know that our agents find themselves in this kind of a situation. It's like, okay, what do I do? So there's nothing, first of all,
let's start with
sure.
Take a look at the LSUs as they come in. Because oftentimes this happens and agents have no idea until closing time.
Right. And one of the things that we're hearing too, when we do the certification and designation classes from, a lot more experienced agents, they're seeing a lot of counteroffers now to the contract when it comes to that requirement in the contract that says at a minimum lines 1 through 40 of the LSU are to be completed. And they're seeing a lot of them now where they're countering that and saying, contrary to these lines in the contract, the buyer is to provide from their lender both pages completed. And their rationale and reasoning is page 1 can be fulfilled or filled out by the buyer alone. But page 2 is completed by the lender. And then, one of the other things that comes up, and I know I'm trying to cover a lot of things, but, it brings up so many different issues. the question has often been asked, can the realtor, the buyer broker, fill out that page one for them? And I've heard many people say yes, they can. But I also know that some of the top real estate attorneys I've talked with said, no, you can't, that it would be inappropriate because it says it's from the buyer.
Mhm.
So we want to be careful with that one. But so when you come into this, Todd, you're very correct. The contract itself talks about it, and when we're talking about changing from conventional to FHA in the first 10 days, there's nothing magical about the 10 days.
Right. Anytime. Yep.
But
Right.
that is something that many agents think is applicable based on the other things they see in the contract. And so what if the seller doesn't want to consent? Well, one of the things they can do, I mean, just starting from the beginning, they can say, okay, you've made this change. I need to have something in writing, showing that it's not going to cost me any more money. Or if I've gone with VA, are there costs that I now have to pay? Or what are the differences with these things? But, when you bring up the appraisal, that was something that was discussed also, Mike, but the comment was, suppose it's conventional financing and the appraisal doesn't come in. You've got another issue then that you're going to have to deal with, the same as you would FHA. However, you're correct. If another FHA buyer comes in, they're bound to that. I believe it's still for 4 months.
Code the case number,
Pardon me?
the appraisal case number
Yes.
on the property. Yeah.
Yeah. That was the last I heard, that it still is there. So there are an awful lot of different issues that come up in here. And one of the things that has often been talked about, what are the seller's rights if he doesn't want to consent? Well, he can ask for an updated LSU from the lender regarding the FHA financing. There's always the possibility of a cure notice, if this comes to fruition. Or the other part is saying, hey, sorry, but this isn't okay because it's going to cost me more money. So now you're bound to continue with what was accepted in the beginning.
Mhm.
So there are a lot of times in here. And, how can the listing agent avoid the dilemma? What are your thoughts?
Well, before we get into that,
Sure.
one of the other caveats in here is traditionally, let's just say the original contract said 5% down because it was conventional loan. Now all of a sudden this LSU comes through and they're going FHA and they're now only putting 3.5% down. Does that change the terms of the contract enough to be able to cure the buyer?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm not an attorney,
Right.
but I don't think so. The thing is, does it affect the buyer's ability to get the loan approval?
So to that same point, if we're looking at hash mark number 2, the second sentence, buyer's ability to obtain loan approval. If, say, for instance, Mike, it was going the other way, say it was maybe saying I asked to be approved at 5% in the pre-qual, and the LSU came through with an approval, but it was at 10% down. Now, there's two things. Number one, the buyer may not have that extra money, so that may make it more difficult for the buyer
Correct.
to qualify,
Correct.
which would lay that part in there. Or the other particular piece was that not I can't think of the other half of that. But so go ahead on to another one. I'll add it back if I can remember it. Yeah. I was holding on to it, waiting for an opportunity to bring it to light, but I can't remember the other half.
Well, and when I was talking about, okay, what can the listing agent do? Be aware of these differences. Be aware about the potential problems or the possible conflicts that you're going to have with appraisals. And is it going to cost more money? Are they going to be stuck with an appraisal if for some reason it doesn't work? So the main thing is being aware of it as a listing. Oh, you just thought of it?
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead
just
while
thought-
you're thinking.
Well, no, I was thinking about it as it affects the unfulfilled loan contingency. So originally it was, I'm going to put 5% down. Then it was 10%. Then maybe the seller negotiated, Mike, to have the lender and the buyer prove they could afford that additional down payment money, so that it no longer becomes an issue. But now, of course, you get to the point where at the point of unfulfilled loan contingency, the buyer comes along and says, you know what, I can't generate that extra 5%. I'm not going to be able to qualify. I'm going to issue an unfulfilled loan contingency clause.
Yeah, then they're going to have to notify them,
Right.
put something in writing.
But yeah, I would say, to my earlier point, I mean, one of the things the listing agent could and should do just review the LSUs as they come in. They're supposed to be coming in weekly. Take a look, because it's just going to make you look bad at the end of the day when you get to the closing table and to only find out that 3 weeks prior it got switched to a conventional to an FHA, and now your seller's incurring more costs, and now you're at the point of no return.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to know the contract does not require an LSU to be provided every 10 days. What happens is it's upon request from the seller side. So if it's your practice, so Mike, you're more than likely digging into one of your systems that you have on the team, which is brilliant, which is, hey, I'm going to make sure, I'm going to make sure my listing agent contacts the buyer's lender every 10 days and requests an LSU. That's good.
Yep.
All right. Scenario number 2. Buyer and seller enter into a contract. The seller is unaware of any HVAC problems and does not disclose any HVAC problems on the spuds. On day 2 of the inspection period, the buyer discovers a problem with the HVAC system. So point number 1, when the buyer discovers HVAC problem, when is the buyer obligated to notify the seller?
You may want to go ahead and look at all three.
Okay.
First, yeah.
Okay. When the number 2, when the buyer notifies the seller of the HVAC problem, is the seller obligated to notify the buyer of the changes in the seller's spuds disclosures? And then number 3, when does the buyer's 5 days to provide notice of disapproval start upon discovery of the HVAC problem or upon receipt of the seller's notification of changes in the spuds disclosures?
You really are trying to create a corkscrew, aren't you?
Yeah, well, and the thing is, the one thing I do want to just point out, Mike, on the first scenario, you said, I don't know. So that gives me one check mark on my column. Just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, but I got the other part of that right. So there was 3 questions, so there's 2/3 I got right, so I'm up.
Yeah, but you won a check mark because you said you didn't know versus trying to go along thinking you did.
Okay, so let's go on with with this.
Go ahead, Mike.
Why do I always have to go first?
You don't. I'll go first.
Okay, go first.
Okay. So in this particular case, first of all, it says, if they're in the inspection, it's a day 2 of the inspection period in the first paragraph. Buyer discovers a problem. They're in the inspection period. That's not a change to the property necessarily. It's just something that popped up that wasn't included in SPDS, like anything else that pops up on a inspection report. When does the buyer discover the HVAC? When they do, what's the buyer obligated to notify the seller? I think if basically in the BINSR, no later than the end of the 10-day inspection period. However, if the buyer really is still serious about this property, they may want to tell the seller as early as possible, only to help facilitate the moving on of the contract if this isn't going to be a problem. Because you certainly don't want to issue a BINSR early, because if you do, the line right before the signature of the BINSR says that this is the end of the buyer's inspection period. We've conducted all the investigations and inspections we desire.
You're a brat. That's a good catch.
Then when the buyer notifies the seller of the HVAC problem, is the seller obligated to notify the buyer of the changes? No, but they would need to, and not to give back to the existing buyer, but they would need to update that SPDS if for some reason that buyer were to bail. They would obviously have to add that change to the SPDS. When does the buyer's 5 day to provide notice approval start? It starts when a buyer realizes they have a different problem with a property that was not discovered during the inspection period and not made part of it. Any changes from the end of the inspection period to close of escrow, they have 5 days from notice of the problem. When they knew, or here's the question I don't have an answer to, Marge. The old-fashioned, if they knew or quote-unquote should have known. So that's my question, to use the should have known part. But other than that, I'd say 5 days from the point of notice of anything from that point back.
Okay, and I know what Mike's going to do. Mike's going to say ditto.
Yeah, what Todd said.
And you would be right in saying ditto what Todd said.
Mike.
So 1 2/3 to 1/3.
No, we're not doing fractions. But, going through this whole thing, again, this is something that often happens. And like you said, okay, so the buyer may want to give notice to the seller immediately of what they learned or as soon as possible. However, where they make the mistake, which you caught. They make the mistake by putting it on the Binzer, saying, hey, let's let them know about this, and then we'll complete it because we've still got 8 more days in our inspection period. And that would be the wrong assumption, because the minute you give it to them, that ends the inspection period. Again, they say it has to be done in a single notice. So if they're going to do that,
That's a good point, term.
They might have their buyer broker contact the listing agent and say, by the way, here's something that came up that we'll give you some advance notice on. So that might be one way to do it. And the safer way, you do not want to put it in writing and have the inspection period ended at that point in time.
Yeah, so that's my process. If during the inspection period, because I typically don't submit the Binzer until day 9 or day 10, but if some of the big ticket items do pop up, we're always letting the agent know just to let, because I don't want to go back and forth. I like to negotiate as much as I can verbally and before we put things on paper,
Right.
Yeah, and I look at it from the perspective of a seller doesn't know how much whatever this pretended problem or intended or perceived problem is going to cost them. So they need time to get somebody out. If you wait until
an
the end of
estimate.
the Binzer, if you give the Binzer, even on day 10, you give the Binzer, the seller now has 5 days to reply. So within that 5 days to reply, there's no way they're going to get an inspector out there from that HV. Probably not going to be able to get an inspector out there to do that. And they're just not going to have any idea how much the cost is going to be.
So then the next scenario then, Marge, in this, so let's say we go through the inspection period, everything works, and we negotiate the Binzer, everything's fine. Then on day 20, where the client requests access to measure or whatever, and they go in and then notice that the HVAC now is no longer working.
Correct.
What happens?
Okay, it's an entirely different situation because once again, Todd caught it beautifully when we're talking about, okay, does the seller have to notify the buyer about these things in writing or updating the spuds? And the answer is no, not for this buyer, because it's this buyer's inspector who discovered this. So they
In
know.
this scenario. Yep.
But let's carry it to yours now. But to follow that through to the end, if this transaction doesn't go through for some reason, then absolutely that buyer or that seller does need to put it in his spuds for any subsequent buyer. Now, in your scenario, okay, so there weren't any problems. So now what they're going to have to do is send a notice over to the seller saying, here's something we just discovered. And accordingly, this is something that we want to have fixed. You're going to have to negotiate, something at that point. Does the seller have to make the repairs? No. But if the seller chooses not to, then the buyer has an out, because the contract states very clearly that the home is being sold in its present physical condition. So it was working before, it isn't working now. That would give the buyer the opportunity to either try and negotiate that repair or cancel the contract if it isn't fixed.
Right, because that falls under the same condition as it was as of the data contract situation.
Correct.
So, yeah.
Correct.
All right, scenario number 3. This is one of my favorites. We go through this all the time, but buyer completes the inspection. Buyer wants to negotiate a reduction in the purchase price in lieu of repairs. The buyer's agent checks the box on the Binzer that states buyer elects to provide seller an opportunity to correct or address the disapproved items listed below. Attach an addendum if applicable. Under items disapproved, the buyer's agent writes, see addendum. The addendum asks for a $5,000 reduction in the purchase price, but does not, I know the answer. I'm just going to go ahead and ding me. The addendum asks for a $5,000 reduction in the purchase price, but does not specify the items disapproved. The seller does not want to reduce the purchase price. So question number 1. If the seller does not respond within 5 days, is the buyer obligated to close escrow at the original purchase price, or is the buyer entitled to cancel and a return of the buyer's earnest money? The answer is no. And I'm going to go into the second question before I tell you why. Is the seller obligated to give the buyer a cure notice for failure to list the items disapproved? The answer is no. So going back to point number one, yes, we do this all the time. We do negotiate, closing cost credits and things like that in lieu of repairs. It's done all the time. And we do have language in our BINSR says, see addendum 3 or see addendum 1, whatever the case is. However, you have to list disapproved items. If you do not have at least one disapproved item on that list, then you are not completing the BINSR correctly, and the seller then is not obligated to reduce the price. Buyer cannot walk because the BINSR is not filled out correctly.
Okay, I don't really disagree, but I don't like the way in which you said it.
Well, I'm not an attorney nor a broker,
well,
so
I'm not an attorney either,
cut me some slack.
Yeah, well, I do, because I might get this wrong too. So but it's not over yet. Okay, so it says the addendum asks for $5,000. First of all, the BINSR itself, giving the seller the ability to correct it. What would the outcome of that be if there was no other moving pieces? Then the fact would be that the seller, if they don't reply within 5 days, has accepted the terms of the buyer's BINSR and will actually then be responsible for repairing it if it was listed, if that item was listed. Now, if in fact the BINSR comes along with an addendum that basically says, with the addendum, the BINSR says buyer elects to move forward with the understanding that the seller will sign the attached addendum. Then otherwise the buyer will elect to cancel the deal. The seller then has the right to decide whether they want to, sign that addendum or not at that particular point. But the seller doesn't reply. So the hash marks, if the seller doesn't reply within 5 days to the BINSR, then the seller's accepted whatever's on the BINSR. However, if they don't sign the purchase contract, then the seller's agreeing to the addendum. Excuse me.
I disagree with
you.
you.
Then the seller would be responsible for still repairing it because they didn't reply, but they wouldn't be responsible for an addendum they never signed for $5,000.
If the seller does not, we're going to fight now. I love this.
Oh, good. That's the boxes.
If the seller does not acknowledge or sign the BINSR, then that's the buyer's clue that the seller is saying no, and then the buyer has a time period then to determine whether they want to walk or accept the original terms with nothing from the seller.
That is correct.
Oh, I had it backwards. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
All right, Mike, you win.
Come on, Nikki. How about a little?
I told you don't decline so early.
But the thing that I'm loving about this morning actually is that the questions and the back and forth and interpreting things one way or another, that's what's happening with all of our agents in the field on a daily basis. And, depending on who they last talked with, I mean, it could be, let me just use you, Todd, for a second, where you said, okay, then the seller's obligated.
Yeah.
That's what they heard. What you thought you said was the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
So we can very unintentionally give bad advice.
Of course.
And not realize.
That's just a Monday for me.
That's why you call your broker instead of listening to another agent.
But I mean, it sincerely can happen. And that's where I tell our agents all the time and brag as subtly as I can when I'm doing the certification or designation courses about how fortunate we are to have the caliber of broker knowledge and experience in our company, which is second to none. I mean, honest to goodness, we are so fortunate to have our 5 brokers, and we're so fortunate to have other people. And I'll use you, Todd, because I know you have a following, and people will call you. Mike, you have your team, and they're going to follow you. So, I mean, we're just fortunate. And some of them are silly enough to call me, and I'm happy to give them answers too. But the other question, though, is the seller obligated to give the buyer a cure notice for failure to list the items disapproved?
The answer is no.
The answer is yes, they are. Why? Because that's what the contract says.
Really?
So you've got to go back to what the contract says.
Okay, so if the buyer does not issue a BINSR.
Okay, they don't issue a BINSR?
Oh,
okay. Are you going down that road? That's different.
Well, what's the items of list items disapproved? That would be on the BINSR.
Okay, let me see which part.
So you said, but you started your conversation with, so if the buyer doesn't deliver a BINSR, that's how you started it. Is that the way you want it? Because
Yeah.
this one had a BINSR submitted, but
Okay.
with the
All right.
addendum.
Yeah, and the only other thing that I would stress quickly before we go to the last scenario is when we're talking about the words in here where it says or address, because Mike, you were correct. We were seeing the recommendations or the requests for price reductions a lot, which were not contractual.
Right.
That's not what was intended. So this was recently changed, which now gives them the right. The seller is not obligated to accept it. It's like anything else where they can negotiate.
Yeah. So then just my process is I submit a BINSR. Here's all the items that disapproved, and I want to overwhelm the seller, or kind of language, my TC does it, but or seller to contribute X amount of dollars in seller concessions in lieu of repairs per addendum, whatever, and then I attach the addendum to the BINSR. That's how I do it.
Good.
All right. So we really don't have time for back and forth on this one, but if a buyer's pre-qualification form stated an interest rate not to exceed 5%, but the buyer did not lock the interest rate at 5% during the inspection period and can get the other loan terms described under pre-qualification form LSU at 6%. So will the buyer be obligated to close escrow or find themselves in breach of contract after the expiration of the cure period? I'd say no. If the LSU changes the terms on the pre-qual, say, for example, lowering interest rate not to exceed, would that require seller approval per section 2K? So if the pre-qualification form says not to exceed 5%, and then the buyer's loan comes in at 6%, then I would say then the buyer can walk and get a unfulfilled loan contingency.
Okay, so contract says that if by chance the buyer does not lock the interest rate during the inspection period? No, does not lock the interest rate. If it's important to the buyer that the interest rate be considered as an item to be fulfilled, then they have to lock the rate. If they don't lock the rate, they'll be basically in breach of contract if they can't close at the 6%. But if in fact, I'm trying to read through this quickly because we're almost out of time. And then, of course,
Marge, why don't you just go ahead and give us
the rest of it.
So the bottom line is if they do not lock it in, and they can qualify at the 6%, like it or not, they're obligated to do it because they chose not to lock in. Correct. If they really want to stress, hey, I will not take anything unless it's at 5% or more, then I, as the listing agent, am now going to say to my seller, before we commit to this, let's talk to the lender and find out if those funds are available and if they, have locked it in, if it's going to be available.
But if they don't lock it in and it goes to 6% and they cannot qualify at 6%, then the lender can issue a unfulfilled loan contingency, right?
Correct.
All right. All right, Marge, I beat Todd again. It feels so good.
Wait, you beat Todd? How'd you figure that?
Mike always beats Todd, Marge. He has his own made-up little points in his head, so we just give him the win and we move on.
Gotcha.
Todd's accepted his plight.
I just have. Yeah.
Well, thanks for the explanation, Nick. Now I understand. Thank you, guys. This was
I
nice.
appreciate
awesome.
it. That was some good stuff.
That was good. I like that.
All right. For Michael Jordan, I can accept failure. Everyone fails at something, but I can't accept not trying. Todd, we appreciate you trying this morning. Appreciate everybody joining us today. Go out and sell home.